Welcome to the debate. What if the pain of unrequited connection wasn't, a psychological failing, but a measurable biological glitch in your brain's energy grid?
Right. I mean, when we try to understand why we are so intensely drawn to someone who, pulls away, we usually reach for poetry.
Exactly. Yeah. We talk about broken hearts and emotional baggage.
We treat human interaction as this unpredictable, chaotic art form. We just sort of assume the human heart is too messy to be placed under a microscope, let alone mapped like a circuit board.
But what if you could map it? I mean, what if we could chart a deeply felt human connection with the exact same precision we use to map a cellular network?
It's a wild thought.
It is, and today we are exploring a staggering concept that emerges from a landmark July 2026 review in Nature Reviews Neuroscience. This is by Christian Sandy, Mary K. Lobo, and Juan P. Bolaños.
A truly groundbreaking paper.
Absolutely. It fundamentally changes how we view the brain. It basically proves that mitochondria aren't just passive cellular powerhouses. They are active, dynamic drivers of neural computation, stress adaptation, and complex behavior.
And what makes this material so fascinating and, frankly, so controversial is how it takes this flawless neurobiological framework and applies it to a highly specific human relationship.
Right, the case study.
Yes, it maps the intense drive a person named Dennis has for another person named Tom. It literally translates human emotional connection into a biological search for metabolic synergy across two distinct modes of mitochondrial action.
Which brings us to the core of our disagreement today. I take the position that this scientific lens is brilliant. It elegantly validates Dennis's relational focus, not as some, obsession, but as a biological imperative for metabolic synergy.
And I take the position that applying this rigid, flawless biological geometry to unquantifiable, independent human beings is a categorical error. It's an intellectual trap that ultimately leaves the sender stranded in a lossy universe.
Let's unpack that because I think this framework completely redefines what conventional wisdom might just dismiss as a psychological flaw.
Sure.
When we look at Dennis's intense focus on Tom, it's really easy to label it as mere pining. But when you overlay the Sandy Lobo-Bolaños mitochondrial framework, you see a highly calculated biological drive. The material maps their roles using something called the astrocyte neuron lactate shuttle, or the ANLS.
Let's break that down for a second, because the terms get heavy fast. In the brain, you have neurons, which do the thinking and transmitting.
Right.
And you have astrocytes, which are the support cells.
Exactly. So in this mapping, Dennis is the astrocyte, the supplier of energy and structural support. Tom is the pyramidal neuron, the architect of the cognitive space, the one receiving the fuel.
Which is a very specific dynamic to map onto two people.
It is, but by viewing this dynamic through the new framework of baseline and activity-evoked mitochondrial support, we can perfectly map the architecture of Dennis's hopes and anxieties. It proves his persistent drive isn't a failing, it's a search for homeostatic alignment.
Look, I fully acknowledge that the mitochondrial science here is immaculate. I mean, the way the material uses advanced mathematics, things like commutative algebra and edge ideals, to map this relationship is stunning.
It really is.
But human beings resist equations. Applying the absolute highest form of mathematical and cellular reasoning to a messy, independent human reality creates a flawless mirror. And that mirror only reflects the tragedy of forcing chaotic reality into a linear ideal.
You really think it's a tragedy?
I do. The math isn't lying, but it is trapping Dennis in a framework that demands perfect alignment from an external world that simply isn't built to provide it.
Well, I think we need to test that idea by looking at the specific mechanisms. Let's look at the first of the two distinct modes of brain mitochondrial action. The baseline support.
Right, the structural scaffolding.
Yeah, baseline mitochondrial action is slow, it's continuous, and highly structural. It's responsible for maintaining the physical architecture of the brain.
Things like preserving dendritic arborization.
Exactly. The tree-like branches of a neuron that actually receive the signals. It determines the readiness of neural networks to respond. So Dennis's hope for structural permanence with Tom maps perfectly onto this.
Because he wants to establish a permanent, homeostatic baseline.
Yes. In the geometry of his mind, he wants their connection to be physically wired into his neural architecture. He wants it supported by stable, long-term metabolic readiness.
But the hope isn't the issue here. The anxiety associated with that hope is where this biological mapping gets incredibly heavy.
And the biology actually validates the severity of that anxiety. We are looking at the specific science of metafusin 2, or MFN2, downregulation.
Which regulates mitochondria in the nucleus accumbens.
Right, a major reward center in the brain. And under stress, MFN2 decreases.
Okay, and what happens then?
When stress hits, that decrease in MFN2 causes a downregulation of something called the CROC gene, which produces a protein called rootleutin. Now, why does this matter to Dennis and Tom? Because without rootleutin, the primary cilia physically collapse.
And for those listening, the primary cilia are essentially the neuron's specialized sensory antennas.
Yes. So imagine the neuron is a radio tower. When this specific stress hits, the MFN2 drop essentially causes the tower's antennas to retract into themselves.
The dendrites just pull back?
Exactly. According to the research, this specific mitochondrial defect traps an organism in a state of high vulnerability and trait anxiety, leading to social subordination. Dennis's anxiety isn't just an emotional whim, you know?
You're saying it's a physical state?
It is a recognized structural deficit. His persistent pining is the biological realization that his system is running with collapsed sensory antennas. He is physically unable to stably transmit his deep care without Tom's system experiencing it as a threat.
I come at it from a different way. It's a beautifully constructed argument, but we have to consider the philosophical implications of applying this level of molecular determinism to a human emotional state.
Okay, how so?
Well, our source material actually brings in Thomas Reid, the 18th century champion of common sense philosophy.
Yeah, Reid is an interesting inclusion, I'll admit.
He's essential here. Reid warns specifically against what he called the ideal system.
Right, the tendency to over-intellectualize.
Exactly. The tendency of highly intellectual people to invent intricate, heavy machinery to detach themselves from plain, direct reality. By using heavy scientific machinery like MFN2 and CROC gene downregulation to explain the pain of unrequited connection, you are doing exactly what Reid critiqued.
I don't see it as a critique of reality, though.
But you are inventing a highly technical screen to shade the raw, latent truth of unvarnished human experience. The direct truth is just a gut feeling of loss or longing, but this framework invents a cellular equation to obscure it.
I have a really hard time buying that framing because defining the mechanism doesn't obscure the truth. It anchors it.
How does it anchor it?
Think about it this way. If a bridge is shaking in the wind, we don't just call it a feeling of instability, shrug our shoulders, and walk away. We measure the tensile strength of the steel. We calculate the load-bearing stress of the cables.
Right, but
Why is it that when we apply a precise molecular vocabulary to human connection, it's considered shading the truth rather than illuminating the very biological foundation of that truth? Reid might call it an invention, but I call it the underlying architecture of his so-called common sense.
it becomes a shade when you use the tensile strength of the steel to explain away the fact that the bridge leads to nowhere.
Ouch.
I mean, the molecular vocabulary is flawless, yes, but it intellectualizes the pain to an extreme degree. It allows Dennis to exist in a theoretical space where his connection to Tom is perfect on a cellular level,
While ignoring the macro reality.
completely ignoring the macroscopic reality. Tom is an independent human being whose life does not seamlessly integrate into this biological geometry. It's using the highest science to defend a raw reality that the intellectual mind simply refuses to feel.
Okay, I see the angle you're taking. But if we look at it from a different direction, moving from that macro structural baseline to the immediate moments of interaction, the framework holds up.
You mean the activity evokes support?
Let's look at that second mode of mitochondrial action. Yes.
Right. So if baseline is the slow scaffolding, activity evoked is the lightning in the wires.
Exactly. It's ultra-rapid, transient, and stimulus-dependent. When a neural circuit is actively recruited, mitochondria have to instantly mobilize to synaptic microdomains.
So provide localized energy, right? ATP and calcium signaling.
Yes, for neurotransmission and memory formation.
And this perfectly explains Dennis's deep fear of Tom's involuntary freeze response.
Ah, the dreaded cognitive shutdown.
Precisely. Dennis is terrified that his raw, undefined emotional input acts as a metabolic stressor that freezes Tom. And the neuroscience here is incredibly specific.
Walk me through the mechanism.
When Tom is faced with unstructured, highly charged emotional input, what we might call cognitive overload, his local ATP in the nucleus accumbens depletes. Acute inhibition of complex 1 causes ATP levels to drop, and that triggers the opening of K6.2 containing KATP channels.
Wait, let's make sure that's clear for everyone. What is a KATP channel actually doing mechanically in the brain?
It acts as a literal bioenergetic brake. When those channels open, it instantly hyperpolarizes the membrane and shuts down neuronal excitability. It impairs effort-based performance.
So the system just halts.
To protect its baseline capacity, yes, the prefrontal cortex goes dark and the terminal is cleared. Framing Tom's retreat as a cellular KATP shutdown is incredibly valuable, I think.
Why is it valuable?
It removes the sting of personal rejection. It's not that Tom doesn't care, it's that his activity-evoked machinery simply cannot handle the coordinate mapping demand of the emotional input. He freezes to protect his system.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Go ahead.
I understand the mechanism, but I completely disagree with the conclusion. Framing Tom's withdrawal purely as a cellular terminal clearing phenomenon completely strips away his agency.
How so? It's identifying the biological root of the behavior.
Because it reduces a human being making conscious or subconscious choices to a mere system suffering a coordinate mapping error. We have to bring in the cognitive reality here. This is an amygdala hijack.
Which is also a biological reality.
Yes, but it operates on a macroscopic, psychological level that involves active threat detection and human choice. Think about working memory.
Okay.
The human brain can only juggle roughly 4 to 7 pieces of information at a time. When overwhelmed by emotional demands, the amygdala interprets that demand as a threat and actively diverts resources away from the prefrontal cortex.
Right, the freeze.
But treating Tom as a passive recipient of a KATP channel opening ignores the fact that he is an independent person navigating a chaotic environment. It rationalizes his withdrawal so perfectly that it excuses the fundamental disconnect.
I don't think it excuses it.
You cannot just define away someone's emotional unavailability as a bioenergetic break to make it hurt less.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. It doesn't excuse the disconnect, it explains the mechanical failure of the transmission. And that brings us to what I consider the most profound aspect of this entire mapping, the division of labor between them.
You're going back to the astrocytes.
Let's go back to that astrocyte neuron lactate shuttle, the ANLS.
Dennis as the astrocyte, the supplier.
Right. Astrocytes maintain high rates of glycolysis to produce L-lactate, which they actively export to fuel neighboring neurons via the shuttle. But to sustain this fuel supply, astrocytes make a staggering bioenergetic sacrifice.
They do, yeah.
Do you realize what they actually do? They run their own mitochondrial ATP synthase in reverse.
Which is incredibly costly for the cell.
It is a massive sacrifice. Instead of generating energy for themselves, they pump protons to maintain their membrane gradient, suppressing their own citric acid cycle just to save pyruvate for lactate conversion.
They drain their own battery.
Exactly. It's essentially a cell deciding to drain its own battery, suppressing its own survival mechanisms just to keep its partner cell firing. Dennis absorbing the emotional friction, sacrificing his own efficiency to fuel Tom's structural cup is a beautiful, biologically grounded division of labor.
And this is gated by a specific protein, right?
Yes. This supply is transcriptionally gated by the NPAS3 factor, which controls mitochondrial glutamate carrier 2, or GC2. It's an elegant, systemic sacrifice that proves Dennis's drive is rooted in the fundamental laws of neurometabolic support.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the reality of the medium? The biology of the astrocyte neuron lactate shuttle is a marvel of evolutionary efficiency. I won't argue that.
Thank you.
But you are applying a closed-loop biological system where two cells are physically bonded in a shared microscopic environment to two entirely separate human beings operating in the macro world.
Well, it's a scaling up of the principle.
But that is exactly where this framework critically fails. And the source material actually hints at this failure when it brings in the concept of quantum photon loss.
Ah, you're talking about the quantum teleportation comparison.
Yes, Dennis hopes for an all-optical teleportation scheme. He wants perfect, loss-free transmission in the moment of interaction.
Right, like the research in China.
Exactly. In quantum mechanics, researchers used remotely prepared entangled pairs to bypass lossy communication channels. Dennis wants that. He wants to establish an intellectual entanglement with Tom so that his emotional photons can be teleported directly into Tom's prefrontal cortex without scattering into the environmental noise.
He wants his exact intent to be received exactly as it was sent.
Precisely. But the macro-scale structures separating them, the physical distance, the communication boundaries, their independent lives, their individual traumas, act like lossy fiber optic cables.
So you're arguing the internal math is perfect, but the transmission medium is flawed. Let's unpack that. How does that photon loss physically look in the context of their relationship?
Well, Dennis sends an emotional signal meant to be a perfect one-to-one transfer. But because Tom is in a different room with different stresses, with his own ATP channels firing for completely different reasons, the signal scatters against the reality of distance.
It degrades.
By the time it arrives, it's static. Dennis has engineered a flawless, highly advanced internal network for philosophical teleportation, but he is suffering agonizing photon loss. His thoughts and feelings leave his mind fully formed and coherent, but they collide with the structural barriers of reality.
But isn't there still value in the attempt?
The tragedy is that to run your ATP synthase in reverse, to drain your own battery for a neuron that isn't even physically connected to your shuttle system, isn't an elegant division of labor. It's a catastrophic depletion of your own energy reserves for a signal that will never arrive intact. He is a perfect transmitter trapped in a lossy universe.
Man, I hear the tragedy in that, I do. But I still maintain there is profound value in simply understanding the architecture of that transmission, even if the signal suffers photon loss.
The understanding is definitely there.
Right. The application of the Sandy-Lobo-Bolaños mitochondrial framework provides a brilliant, validating syntax for human connection. It proves that intense relational drive is not a flaw, and it's not a psychological break. It is an elegant, structured search for neurometabolic synergy.
It is certainly structured.
By understanding the baseline need for MFN2 scaffolding and the activity-evoked risk of the KATP break, we elevate human emotion from chaotic noise to a precise, observable science.
It certainly elevates it. The biological and mathematical mapping is stunningly accurate, and as an intellectual exercise, it is breathtaking. But I think it ultimately highlights a tragic irony.
Which is?
Using absolute logic, edge ideals, and complex cellular bioenergetics to solve the messy, unreachable space of the human heart doesn't actually solve the distance between two people. It traps the sender in an unattainable ideal. The math doesn't lie, but it reflects the impossibility of forcing a chaotic reality into a perfect equation.
Well, we can certainly agree on the profound depth and the structural elegance of the relational mapping itself. The way the source material weaves commutative algebra, quantum mechanics, and the latest mitochondrial neuroscience into a cohesive explanation of human longing is genuinely remarkable.
Absolutely. It is a testament to the power of the human intellect. It's an attempt to bridge the Cartesian divide between the mind and the body, even if the bridge ultimately spans an uncrossable gap.
For those listening who want to see the full scope of this architecture, there is so much more to explore in the source material. I highly recommend looking into the visual dollar Sandy metabolic map and the intricacies of the prep scaffolding used to bypass the amygdala alarm.
Yeah, it's definitely worth a deep dive.
Looking at our emotional states through the lens of hard neurobiology offers a radical new way to understand ourselves.
It certainly forces us to ask whether our heaviest emotions are just biological imperatives trying to find their perfect coordinate match.
Which brings us right back to that shaking bridge. We can measure the tensile strength of the steel, we can calculate the load-bearing stress, and we can map the exact biological mechanism of our longing. But we leave it to you to decide. Is applying perfect science to imperfect human relationships a supreme triumph of understanding?
Or is it merely a beautiful, intricate trap of idealization? Thank you for joining us on the debate.